Broadcasting from the campus of Salisbury University, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. It's time for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Gilbert Byron has been called a Chesapeake Thoreau, and tomorrow marks his birthday. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Gilbert Byron was born on July 12, 1903, and he died just before his 88th birthday in 1991. Byron published 11 books, including 7 works of poetry and 3 novels. His best known is The Lord's Oyster. For much of his life, he lived alone in a cabin on a cove near St. Michael's with no electricity, no heat, and no running water, bought for $133.17. It was here that he wrote The Lord's Oyster, and his works center on the eastern shore and its environment, from the marshes to the calls of the birds that echo across the landscape. In our studio is Jack Baker, who has written a biography of Byron's life entitled Gilbert Byron, A Life Worth Examining, and welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Don. Glad to be here.
Well, let me ask you, first of all, how did you become involved in being interested in his life, Byron's life, and how did you, and I understand that ultimately you got to know him?
Well, I'll try to make it chronologically as brief as possible. I first came across Gilbert, or he came across me, when I was a student in his 11th grade history class at Easton High School back in the early 50s. And he stood me in his class for another year until 1954 when I left high school, and he went on down to teach at St. Michael's. Our paths didn't cross again until several years later, after I had returned to Maryland, although not this side of the Bay, and I was home visiting my parents on a Thanksgiving break, and a friend of mine took us down to visit Gilbert Byron unannounced, and we spent a very interesting evening with him. So that was about 1964 or 5, and I didn't really connect with him other than at high school reunions until I moved back to the shore in 1976, and our paths started to cross a little more frequently. And as he was aging at that point, as we all are, but he was also losing his sight, which I think was a tragic for anyone, but for a writer it must have even been more so. And I started working with him on keeping him doing what he was doing, his writing and making appearances and that sort of thing. And I was not exactly a guardian, but he did give me his power of attorney, and then upon his death I was his personal representative, and I settled his estate, and I got access to his papers over time through that happenstance. So that's it in a nutshell, how I got to know him and how we got together. And we became friends in the last few years, and it was quite an experience, and it's nothing I would have planned, but nevertheless it happened, and here we are today, still at it.
So what was he like?
Well, he was, as a teacher, he was, again, I often tell people, some of my classmates in high school got very close to him. Some went fishing with him, visited him. They sort of knew he was a writer. I was not one of those. I was one that took all my, at the end of the day, hung all my teachers in the closet, and we'd get them out, and the next morning there they were, and I didn't really think much about teachers' personal lives. But as I got to know him later in life, I was working with him, fairly frequently, especially the last 5 or 6 years. He was a very intelligent person, very kind, gentle person, really, and he didn't seek controversy even in his writings, but he was almost, it turned out, he was secretive, I guess you could say, kept a lot of things close to him. He didn't talk much about his personal life, or just could talk, not entertain, but you'd have serious conversations with him, talk about anything. He was always up to date on politics and what was going on locally, and he was well-read, watched television, but it was a lot of surface stuff, and I didn't really get to know much. I learned more about him after his death through his letters and that sort of thing than I would have ever thought of, and it was just something I know he did not want to talk about during his lifetime.
I mean, one of the things that Tom Horton, who's an environmental columnist and a writer here on the Eastern Shore, one of the things he said that what came to impress me the most about Gilbert was his drive to keep writing, that he had this tremendous ego, and even in his 80s he thought he had a lot to say about the Bay, and that no one could say it better, and that was sort of inspirational to Horton. Was that the kind of man that you met?
Oh,
yes.
He
had lots of opinions about everything?
Yeah, well, he had a lot of insight. I mean, very... He was a history major in college, and I think that was a lot of people thought he was, because he wrote, he must have been an English major, but I was surprised to learn that too. And so he was very astute politically, and yeah, he did. He would talk. He didn't say seek a controversy, and he didn't try to impress on you his views, and he was very, very insightful in the way people think and work, and a lot of it's reflected in his writing. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's, I agree with what Tom said about Gilbert. And, yeah.
So, let's take a look briefly at his life, because I mean, it seems like his writing really takes off after he and his wife Edna separate. So tell me some sense about his history there and what happened there, because he seems to wind up in this cabin for the next 40-some-odd years.
Well, Gilbert and Edna were married at a very young age, and they seemed to be, they were both teachers in Lewis, and things were working out well for them. And he left Lewis under a bit of a cloud and relocated to Dover. And Edna was also a teacher, his wife, and she taught in elementary school in Dover, and he at the high school. And he was writing. He really started publishing. He'd started writing, I guess, writing things down. Or he actually wrote while he was in college, but and he'd written poems and things. But he actually published his first book of poems in 1942, These Chesapeake Men. And he had some success with that. And another book came out the next year, Delaware Poems, and then another. So he was also writing nonfiction. He had a sailboat, and he published this in a yachting magazine and this sort of thing. And but the war, I think, was really taking its toll on Gilbert, and things sort of came to a head in 1945 when a publisher, national publisher, had picked up on one of his Noah stories and wanted to know if he was writing a novel. Of course, he said he was as soon as he got that letter. And his ailing mother had come to live with he and Edna, and he had also left teaching in 1945. So he was home looking after his mother, Edna, although doing probably most of it as he gave her credit for. And it had all this pressure. So things were really happening fast. He started writing The Lord's Oysters in 1945, and that's when he left to come over to the cabin to finish his work. And his mother had died, by the way, in early 1946. I got my date wrong. He came over in 1946 with his dog to finish The Lord's Oysters. Well, he left Edna there, and he stayed on the cabin until December without finishing The Lord's Oysters, came back to Dover because he had a big cold snap there, and he needed a warm place to stay. Well, Edna let him stay until the warm weather, but then he had to leave, and I think my conclusion anyway that he had no other place to go at that point except back to the cabin. It was the only place he had, and that's where he went, and I don't think he intended to stay there for the next 40-some years, but that's what he did.
Probably his most famous book, of course, is The Lord's Oysters. And I was going to read, there's a sort of prologue here that he writes, so I'll just read a little bit of it. It says, "The moon and tides were full. The summer southwest wind came up the river. It sighed through the tall pines and rustled in the green marshes. Red-winged blackbirds dipped the reeds. Schools of small fry spawned that spring, rumpled the quiet cove, dodged the watchful kingfisher's eye, and the soft crab hid in a mossy cell, waiting for the day when its shell would harden to match the water moccasin's guile." Mm-hmm. One of the things that he seems to be doing a lot of, and it's certainly in his book, but also in his poems, is he really becomes involved with the environment around him. Mm-hmm. And I think as Horton actually talks about how he describes the way the environment is in a very, very intimate way.
No, that's true. He was very much an environmentalist, and I think one of his early poems in These Chesapeake Men. He describes one of his last poems. He's decrying, which was written before World War II started, about what was happening to the bay then. And he described people were polluting the bay. They were throwing, he uses beer cans. They used to be made out of metal, these rusting beer cans. And he just called it almost a hellish thing that was happening to the bay back then. And that was in the 40s. And so he was quite tuned into that. But I think he really got into nature while he was living alone in the cabin of the first few years when he had nothing to do. I shouldn't say nothing to do. He found things to do, and he became a bird watcher, expert bird watcher, and just observing nature, which you just read there. And then he would put it in writing, and it's poetic. What he wrote there, it's prose, but it's words of a poet, and he did that so well.
Do you think this was something that simply came naturally to him, particularly as an observer of nature, or do you think that some of this required him almost being alone in many ways, that being out there?
Well, that's very interesting. I think it came probably more natural to him than most people, but I think he still worked at it. I mean, he would revise, and I think I've never thought about what you just said, but I think it kind of fits into his correspondence he had with a woman in the Chicago area, and he realized that being alone, if he had another companion or changed things, he wouldn't be able to write as he did. And so I think in a way it was probably a constant struggle, needing companionship but also needing the solitude and time to think. I think that did have a great influence and effect on his writing, yes, being alone.
Now, the Lords are sort of semi-autobiographical, I guess, in the sense he certainly draws from his childhood, and I guess his father was a waterman.
That's correct.
Tell me then a little bit about sort of the kinds of the world he describes in this book, because it takes place at somewhere around 1912, 1914, somewhere in that area, because Teddy Roosevelt, I guess, was running for president at the opening of the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, it does. I guess this is probably the end of America's age of innocence, or one of its ages of innocence, where before certainly the World War I had not started, and it would be in the early teens. He was 8 or 9 years old, so making him about 10 or 11, 12 years old. And this Chestertown was certainly in the backwater of our nation then, kind of isolated and small town as it could be. And yet here, I think Gilbert had an knack for taking the ordinary and making it extraordinary in a sense. A lot of people criticize his style. It's simple, but it's very powerful. And but he did. He took that. It's biographical, and when it came out, it just delighted the people in Chestertown because they recognized themselves, and they loved it. The people that he just gave them the different names for the most part, and of course he has the disclaimer there. This is a pure work of fiction, but that's I guess what you put in to protect yourself. But it certainly not everything happened. There are certain things in there that he did dramatize. His dog did not get run over by a calliope in the parade, but anyway, but it was a mean little dog. That part was accurate. So I hope that answers it.
Well, one of the interesting things, particularly about the way he portrays the Father George, is that this is a real waterman. I mean, at one point he actually gets a real job, and it just doesn't work. That's with the bridge. Talk a little bit about that, the dynamic. His father. I mean, there's a couple of opportunities where, okay, I'm going to go get a real job, but his father's always drawn back to the water.
He couldn't escape. He was. That's exactly right. And on the other hand, there was his mother, and that's a sort of a story in itself. His mother was almost 10 years older, I think, than his father. His mother had been married before. I don't know if you're aware of that or not, but she had been widowed. She had been taken from Kent County before her 16th birthday, married a man 36 years old. Took to southern Maryland, and she was widowed in her late 20s and returned to Chestertown with 6 children, none of which was George. And so when Gilbert appeared, and she was 42 years old, and his next oldest half-sibling was 17, or about that age. So in essence, as Gilbert said, he was raised by a grandmother, but aged woman, but treated like a mother, very strict. And she kind of was riding herd on him all the time. And I think she really expected, getting back to your question, a little more out of George. And you can see her prodding in the book, and he's always out off somewhere where he shouldn't be as far as he's concerned. And she was embarrassed when he was selling fish from a push cart or something like that in Chesapeake. But he was a stereotypical waterman. Probably so much of what Gilbert wrote about that was pretty accurate, I think, of what was going on in the life of a waterman of those days. He did have a year, which I think is in there, as bridge tender.
Right, exactly, which is so that the one stress where he just simply couldn't take the stress, and it all sort of came apart.
Right.
But and also he mentions George's father is sort of out there. Tell me a little bit about that character and that relationship, because it seems strange, because he doesn't come and see his father very often.
Well, he was a waterman too. He was I think there's a term that I discovered a reading called a progger. I don't know if that shows up in the thing, but anyway, somebody who poked about in the marshes and got his livelihood from the water, just as his son did. But his grandfather was pretty much on his own, and I don't think he came in the second book, and where takes Noah a little farther down the road. He comes home, at the end of his life. He's brought back into the family, but he's pretty much out on his own. He had an ark, lived in an ark, which is a little like a little raft with a little house on it, and they watermen would often tow this up the river, and they go in the marsh and park it. And they lived there while they hunted or fished. They did whatever they had to do, and so his grandfather sort of just comes in and out. And I don't think Gilbert really knew much about him, but he would see him when his father would go out. He'd usually find him out somewhere in his ark or working the water rather than coming to visit them at home. So yeah, he was another certainly a character, yes.
The other thing, too, that struck me about the book is that Byron does not shy away from, for lack of a better, the bigotry of the era. I mean, you see there's an instance, for instance, of anti-Semitism, and also they have this also an instance of racism, and they have this nurse who takes care of Noah, and there's this incident that occurs. I'll just read a little section. It says, one morning I was so glad to see Rose Mack, that's the nurse, that I hugged her. She bent over and I kissed her and laughed, and Mama saw me. Noah, she yelled, grabbing my arm and jerking me away. You mustn't kiss her. You don't ever want to kiss her again. And don't you let him, Rose Mack. No, ma'am, the nurse said. He did it before I could stop him. I love my Rose Mack, Mama, I said. Why can't I kiss her? You just can't, and if you say anything more about it, I'll get my hairbrush to you. She was mad, and I knew she would. You can see this tension, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting passage, because he did love Rose Mack, and I've talked to people in the past who read it, and they said, oh, Gilbert was prejudiced because he uses the N-word.
That's right, yes.
And I said, well, if the book was written there, it's reported, but you read that section right there, and it's, so apparent, and of course talks with him. He did love Rosemary. He was about 4 years old when she came to keep house, or give, actually apparently at the Bridge House for at least for a year. And he writes about getting lost in the flowers where they took across the bridge, but she really looked after him, and he always thought highly of her. And somewhere, I don't have it, but it's a picture that they all visited the what it was up at Tallchester Bay, the resort there, and Rose Mack had a picture of him taken with her. It's a wonderful picture. There is a picture in the book, a little bit didn't come in well, but it's I wanted it in there anyway to show that. And she was a major influence in his life. I mean, she was good to him, and I guess she was. His mother was a seamstress, so that freed her up to do what she had to do while her. Who knows where George was, either tending the bridge or looking for crabs or something. But no, he always he kept. Rose Mack was a very important person in his life, and she apparently left his life when she reached teenagery, whatever, and went her own way. But he missed her when he found out she wasn't going to come back again.
Yeah, I mean, and then all the in the household, his mother makes this real sharp distinction. I mean, we saw this obviously, and also not being able to eat with the family, but had to eat in the kitchen. I mean, there's this pervasiveness, and there are other instances, I guess, throughout the book where they kind of bump up to up against this sort of racial divide.
That's certainly the way it was, yes.
Yeah. And the other thing is, the other interesting, I guess there's some Jewish family that comes in to town, and again, instead, I mean, this sort of stuff sort of pops up where almost unexpectedly, and the local businessmen obviously are not crazy about the competition that certainly the Zeller family, I guess it is, that has come in. And at one point they're talking, and I thought it really interesting. He says there was one of the local businessmen saying, "Us American businessmen ought to get together and chase the dirty Jew out of town. The next thing you know, one will come in and open a grocery store. You'll feel the way I do then." And Mr. Leary says, maybe he'll move away after making some money. Quote, "Them Jews are great on moving, like as not he'll have a fire and collect the insurance, and if that before he goes." And of course, later on, there is a fire. Again, a strain that just sort of almost a confines in terms of this very, very small world where these sort of prejudices sort of emerge from time to time.
Well, that's the way it was, and probably still is to a large degree. But I think it's interesting the way Gilbert treats this. Well, just the two instances of Roseback and that, it shows you this really isn't a children's book. If you read it, and there's a lot there that it beats the surface, and I think the impression I took away from that part was that the merchant leaves town after the fire, having been accused of setting it. But I get the impression that he didn't set the fire. It's pretty apparent there too that he was basically driven out of town by other merchants or another merchant. So, but and that's the way Gilbert was. I mean, he leads you up to this thing. It's thought provoking, and he says it in such a simple, almost childlike way, which he's done there very effectively.
How do you compare that to, say, somebody like Mark Twain, who also wrote certainly about his own life, and also obviously wrote about fictional lives of Tom Sawyer and so on, where he writes almost episodically, obviously. Runs into the issue of race, but just in general, when I was reading through this, I almost got the impression that there's a certain reflection of the Twain kind of.
Well, I'm not going to go too far down that road. However, I will state that critics have compared this to Huckleberry Finn closely. They do compare Gilbert to Mark Twain in that respect. They too see the similarity there, and I have to confess I haven't read deeply into Mark Twain's work, but that's quite an honor to be placed side by side. Some of the early reviews that came out, New York Times and others, they mention they're very favorable, and they do compare Byron to Mark Twain. That's a pretty good comparison. Pretty good company. So I'd have to accept that.
You accept that. Well, finally, and by the way, we were talking about in terms of this book, we were talking about the end of the book, and how. You saw the last scene, which is the last chapter, which is the Lord's Oyster, that really captured what he was able to gather from his father, who was a waterman, and all the aims. Tell us a little bit about what happens at the end and how that feeling comes across.
Well, the last chapter itself is called the Lord's Oyster, and Lord's Oysters, and it takes place out on the Eastern Bay, just off of Love Point, and it's been a long day. And George. Gilbert's father, George, is skippering the skipjack. George's father was a great skipper, and they've not had much luck oystering when they decide to poach on a oyster bed that's been declared off limits by the state. And it's a stormy day, and they decide to go ahead and do it because, after all, why not? They're the Lord's oysters, and if he wouldn't have put them there if he didn't want us to have them. But there's also a Marine patrol boat there from the Oyster Navy, Maryland, which has a cannon aboard it, and they decide they'd better check and see if it was safe. Well, they didn't see it, so off they went. And during this is a great description of actually launching the dredges and reeling them in, a really wonderfully written description of oystering under sail. And, of course, they get their load, and all of a sudden the cutter appears. So they have only one chance. It's getting late in the day, it's stormy, and they want to, if they can get through the drawbridge at Kent Narrows before 5 o'clock, they'll be safe, because then they'll be down in the Lower Bay, and they can go on back to Cambridge and outrun the revenue cutters.
And I'm going to cut you off there because then people will have to find out just exactly what happens after that. That's
okay.
Right. We would speak with Jack Baker. He has written a biography of Gilbert Byron. It is entitled Gilbert Byron, A Life Worth Examining. And tomorrow will be his birthday. I think it's the 111th birthday, I guess it would have been. 1903.
Yeah, right.
111th.
111th birthday.
We appreciate you taking the time to stop by and talk with us.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush, and thanks for listening.
This has been Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Chris Rank produces and is our audio engineer. Don Rush is your host. For podcasts, visit our website, delmarvapublicradio.net, or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast in iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on PAC 14. To view the schedule, visit the Daily Times or visit pac14.org.